Welcome to the podcast, How to Be Well and Strong. I'm your host, Jacqueline Genova, and I'm excited to have you join me as I speak with some of the leading figures in the fields of wellness, integrative medicine, and mental health, as we discover what it truly means to be well and strong in both body and mind. Get ready to be empowered, inspired, and motivated about being an advocate for your own health. Processed foods, Roundup, health insurance companies and hospitals now operating for profit, and drug companies shifting from cures to chronic treatments that require ongoing medication, these are just a few issues plaguing our healthcare system. In fact, America spends more on healthcare than the next 10 countries combined, yet it has the worst health outcomes. Join me as I sit down and chat with Dr. Jim Roach, a leading expert in integrative medicine, renowned for his comprehensive understanding of cancer strategies. He is a published researcher, national speaker, and consultant with a wide-reaching clientele. Jim's webinars draw significant attention, with one recent event attracting 1,000 registrants. As a #1 Amazon best-selling author, he is also a prominent media communicator, having been interviewed over 100 times on national and international platforms. Specializing in various holistic medicine fields, Jim hosts and presents at nationally attended integrative conferences. He is double-boarded in integrative medicine and has shared his expertise across numerous cities, including major venues like the Mayo Clinic. He is truly a wealth of information. In fact, Jack Canfield called him one of the most encyclopedic minds he's ever met. There were many questions I wanted to ask Jim, and our conversation explored several topics. We discussed why our healthcare system often functions as a sick care system, including the influence of big pharma and medical schools, natural alternatives for common chronic diseases, and the importance of a peaceful mind when it comes to healing, just to name a few. Without further ado, let's get into it. Well, to kick things off, Dr. Roach, so I always love to ask, how did you find yourself in this space? Like, what is your background? Did you always want to become a physician?
Well, actually, way back when I was a kid, I had a next door neighbor to my grandparents whose father was a doctor. And she said, "Are you going to grow up and be a doctor like your father?" And that got me thinking about it. And then when I was in Duke, after my freshman year, I was trying to decide about being a lawyer or being a doctor. And I served as an orderly that summer. There was a gentleman with severe diabetes. He'd had one leg amputated and the other one was precarious, but he had a nurse taking care of him who really looked after him very closely, that he, every time she walked in, he just let up. But then she went on vacation and boom, he went south and he was dead within 2 days. I was impressed by just how powerful that connection was for individuals' health. And I said, well, I can help support patients in that way. I think I'll go that direction.
That's incredible. I'm trying to think, where do I want to start, Dr. Roach? So I listened to your talk this past weekend. I know you've given many, but the one you shared with me, and one thing that really struck me is you touched on just some of the stats behind our healthcare system today, right? With the rise of chronic illness and whatnot. You mentioned that the U.S. now ranks as a leading cause of death due to its healthcare system. Can you elaborate on how systemic issues like for-profit hospitals and drug companies have kind of contributed to that crisis?
Yeah, right. That wasn't an issue. You know, back in the 1960s, I was born in 1952, and with thalidomide, the FDA became particularly vigilant. We were the toughest FDA in the world at that point. A drug had to be really safe before it got through the FDA. And now it's just the opposite. You know, just a year ago, a drug was approved without a single vote from the advisory committee, despite the advisory committee being somewhat tainted by individuals with drug company connections. So that could happen was just incredible. But, and hospitals started becoming for-profit. Humana began buying up and United and others. So hospital systems being for-profit, they have to every year get a bigger share to maintain their quarterly profits. In other words, they can't have the same profit each year. They have to get a bigger profit or else they'll get a new CEO. The shareholders would be unhappy with that. So every year, a bigger piece of the healthcare pie is taking out. And with, other than hospitals, you're mentioning insurance companies. Well, I was talking insurance companies, but hospitals and insurance companies both are in that category. And pharmaceutical companies, of course, have to get increased earnings every year. So they're always asking it. So if we get them to agree to cut the price on this drug or that drug, they'll just balloon the price on another one to kind of compensate for that.
Yeah.
But they're not interested in cures. They're interested in giving patients chronic medications, because if you give a drug that cures the illness, then you don't get to sell any more of it. But
Right.
if you give something that relieves the symptoms but does not treat the underlying issue, and the classic example of that is nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories, right? If you give ibuprofen, that relieves the pain, but ibuprofen blocks angiogenesis, that is growth of blood vessels, which maybe in a tumor scenario may be desirable. But if you're trying to heal a knee joint, do you want to block the growth of blood vessels to be able to supply nutrients to the knee joint? More of concern is, if you have a blockage developing in a coronary artery or a cerebral artery, do you want to block the body's ability to grow collateral circulation around that blockage? If that blockage develops slowly, we naturally develop collateral circulation. Aspirin, ibuprofen, all the nonsteroidals inhibit that effect. And actually, while they thin the blood to protect against clotting and heart attacks, by blocking angiogenesis, that actually promotes heart attacks and stroke.
Along with the many other slew of side effects that you mentioned in that chat. Yeah, it's truly wild. Dr. Roach, so my background is in economics and finance, yet here we are sitting in the wellness space, right? And I shared with you, I'm in this space because of my mom. Interestingly enough, when I was in college, I wrote a thesis on integrative medicine. And my whole thesis was that we need an integrative approach when it came to cancer. Right. And I had a whole chapter just dedicated to the pharmaceutical industry when it came to cancer. And I can't think of a word that describes the extent of, you could say anger that I felt when just, reading all of these statistics between how much money goes into big pharma, especially with cancer, and how cancer is the most profitable sector within our healthcare system. And again, just from my mom's journey over the past 6 or 7 years, always switching to her cancer is ER positive. So obviously, like, you start with the aromatase inhibitors, and then once those stop working, you switch to the CDK4/6 inhibitors, and then those stop working. And it's just like never ending, right? And you'll approach your oncologist and you'll ask, what's next as more of these mutations develop? And their answer is, oh, there's another drug, there's another trial. Right. And it just puts you in this mindset of, but what about the root, right? To your point earlier. And I've done a lot of research, Dr. Roach, on complementary therapies, alternative therapies. My mom's done many, but I guess my question to you too is, you mentioned in that conversation, clinical studies and trials and how 50% are actually accurate, or whatever the stat was that you had mentioned. I ask this for myself too, as an otherwise lay individual, right? How do we discern fact from fiction?
That's a tough question, because it can be very difficult to discern that. Fortunately, I'm not a peer reviewer on one of the journals, but, most landmark studies, first of all, 80% of landmark studies have not been reproducible. So even the landmark studies may not be true at all with that. Because of the drug company advertisements in the journals, if an editor is going to publish a journal study, then if it's, for example, it's on vitamin D or on other natural remedy,
right,
drug companies might get upset about that being published. So, I could go into a number of directions with that, but for a layperson, it's almost impossible to determine that. You really need statisticians and those that are more expert in looking at that scenario. But you want to always look at who's funding the study. That it would have the greatest correlation. Who financially is benefiting by the outcome of the study. Researchers at medical schools, publish or die has been the mantra in the past. And so if a professor at a medical school publishes a study and it has a negative outcome, then what are the odds that they are going to be invited to be in another study funded by a drug company. If another professor got a positive result, which company or which professor is the drug company going to fund? And so there's a built-in bias towards getting positive results. And actually, the number of studies that are accurate is declining rapidly.
My understanding right now, Dr. Roach, is that, pharma has infiltrated medical schools, right? Like that is a part of the education. To what extent were they present in your schooling years ago?
I would say mild to moderate.
Yeah.
And I haven't been in medical schools lately, but I would easily surmise they would be moderate to severe at this stage. And I think the issue is that nutrition's not being taught, which really wasn't taught hardly at all when I was there. So to that degree, there's influence. Certainly vitamins and minerals, almost no discussion about vitamins and minerals in medical school, but their actions are profound in association with that. Obviously, no discussion of botanicals, but we know that there are botanicals like turmeric that have such a wealth of benefits. Turmeric, for example, lowers blood pressure, blood sugar, blood cholesterol, thins the blood, anti-inflammatory, gets toxins out of the system, prevents gallstones, antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral, antidepressant, equivalent to Prozac for depression, 100 anti-cancer properties, not a cancer identified that doesn't have improved outcomes, and reverses amyloid plaque buildup in the brain, characteristic of Alzheimer's, and grows the brain by two mechanisms, right? You would think that'd be important information to be sharing, but I doubt any medical schools, maybe 1% or 5% might share information about turmeric. But that should be standard, of course, and even a primary topic of discussion with them. So, drugs, since there are more and more drugs all the time, right? So I'm sure it's taking up a bigger space to educate about all the prescriptions that are available.
Yeah. So you mentioned some of these other natural alternatives like turmeric, right? Huge turmeric enthusiast right here. You also mentioned rhodiola rosea, which I use as well. I use a few other adaptogen herbs. I am curious, Dr. Roach, for some of the most common, chronic ailments that folks deal with today, what are some of your favorite natural substitutes?
Well, first of all, vitamin D is huge, and it's the top of my protocol list for all of my patients because we all are essentially vitamin D deficient, unless we live at the equator with scant clothing and are outside all day. We're really vitamin D deficient. In my books, in terms of what optimal vitamin D blood levels would be, which for me is 60 to 100 on the scale that's used. And what I've found in doing over 2,000 blood levels with vitamin D is that for 95% of my patients, 1,000 units per 30 pounds is a maintenance dose. Now, the exception to that, acute leukemia, acute lymphoma, maybe Wegener's granulomatosis sarcoma or sarcoidosis, is one to be cautious with. But for the vast majority, using that dosing. And if they're not on vitamin D, then I double that amount. I will go with, for example, 150-pound individual. I'll go with 10,000 units of vitamin D a day for 3 months to build them up, and then drop down to 5,000. Of course, I might look at a blood level to be sure. And that's always wise, starting out after you get them going on vitamin D, to be sure the levels are appropriate with that. And with vitamin D, unless you're on the drug Coumadin, warfarin, you always want to get vitamin K2 along with it. That's really important. If you don't get the vitamin K2, then you're calcifying your arteries and potentially triggering kidney stones. So that would be at the top of the list. I do recommend fish oil for essentially all of my patients. The dosing is important there. You want some, but for example, with atrial fibrillation, high doses of fish oil can promote atrial fibrillation. So you want to, so maybe for me, I use perhaps the equivalent of a teaspoon. That'd be like 1,000, up to 2,000 EPA plus DHA. But 3,000 would be the max I would consider on a daily basis. Magnesium, 70% of us are magnesium deficient, and So magnesium prevents sudden death, prevents heart arrhythmias, coronary artery spasm, for example, and there's 6 different forms of that I use. I do recommend a multivitamin, but the type of multivitamin is very important. I think for most of us, methylfolate is something you want in a multivitamin, but you do not want methylcobalamin most of the time. Methylcobalamin, as it turns out, is, for my patients, is overstimulating, triggering anxiety, and for me, it can even trigger atrial fibrillation with that. So particularly the patients that I see, they have a strong on switch and not a good off switch. And so the methylcobalamin in those individuals is undesirable. So adenosylcobalamin or hydroxyadenosylcobalamin is the preferred form. You don't want to use cyanocobalamin, which is in syndrome, for example, because that has no cyanide and hard on the mitochondrial function in the body. Rhodiola, I do most of the time want patients on an adaptogen, and rhodiola absolutely is my favorite adaptogen. I want patients dreaming nightly, and if they're not dreaming, I want them on the active form of vitamin B6. B6 is pyridoxine, the active form pyridoxine 5-phosphate. And I get a 50 milligram dose from a company called Pure Encapsulation, no financial connections there. And so what I use, I start with 1 with dinner, and every 2 nights, increase the dose, building up to 4. 80% of the time, that will get my patients dreaming every night. And that's key for the transsulfuration pathway from homocysteine down to glutathione. Glutathione is like Velcro attaching to heavy metals and chemicals to get those toxins out of your system and to get estrogen metabolites out of your system. So most of us these days are estrogen dominant. And so strategies to control estrogen dominance and get your testosterone, free testosterone, back up to normal. Excess estrogen, anxiety, panic, obsessiveness are the personality traits. Testosterone is more courage, confidence, motivation. And then dihydrotestosterone, 5 to 10 times stronger than testosterone, bossiness, aggressiveness, quick retorts, right? So you almost determine
personality
by the personality of the individual. Yeah.
Wow. That's wild. One other thing too, Dr. Roach, that I've heard, various folks say is that you should try to get most of your nutrients from food, right? But then the argument is that our soil quality is depleted today. And, you just mentioned several supplements that I personally am huge fans of, but what would you say in response to someone with that argument, right? That they're not huge fans of supplements. You don't know what else is in them. Get everything from food. Like, what would your response be?
Back in the 1800s, yes, I think you could get enough just about from your nutrition. But as you say, soil's been depleted. For example, minerals, they come from rock. And when it rains on mountains with rocks on it, those minerals wash down into the ponds and lakes below, into the rivers. And then when the rivers flood, it gets into the fields. But guess what? If you build dams, then the rivers don't flood, and then you don't get the minerals in the fields. And so all of us now are mineral deficient to some extent associated with that. And of course, with Roundup, glyphosate, you have 1/5 the magnesium and 1/5 the zinc in those plants, and it kills off the soil bacteria, so the amount of B12 in there is also impacted. It also interferes with folic acid and methylfolate in the intestinal tract. So it causes a wealth of problems. The way, and this is key in getting across to male patients, you have to frame everything in terms of testosterone. That's what they hear. All right. So I tell my male patients, days you want testosterone, take your vitamin D. It boosts testosterone 20% in males and blocks estrogen. In days rather have estrogen, skip your vitamin D on those days, right? Or with fish oil, I say days you want to grow your testicles, take your fish oil. Days you'd rather they shrink, skip your fish oil. Men hear that. And B12 and folate do what? They help with the methylation pathway, which generates SAMe, which generates glutathione, once again, to get rid of toxins and to get rid of estrogen metabolites. So days that you want more estrogen, skip your B12 and folate and B vitamins, and you'll get your wish. You'll get a higher pitched voice and get to grow your breasts, guys. And so that usually gets the point across.
So funny. One other thing, too, that comes to mind, Dr. Roach, when you're mentioning all this, how do we know what our levels are? Right. And I've worked with many companies that do more comprehensive testing than your otherwise conventional doctor would do. Right. So is there, aside from working with a functional practitioner, Are there any, certain labs out there that folks could do themselves to assess like where they are with their B12 or where they are with even gene variants, right? I mean, like how much is too much, I guess my question is.
It's a huge question and a very important question. I'm certainly glad you asked that. I think you can trust vitamin D levels at conventional labs. I think those are accurate, but I would keep in mind that individuals with autoimmune issues may have more vitamin D receptor antibodies and therefore may require a little bit larger dose of vitamin D, and also individuals with autoimmune issues. So everyone who's estrogen dominant is more prone to autoimmune issues. Estrogen promotes autoimmune activity. Testosterone strengthens the immune system, but dampens autoimmune activity. And if 1% of physicians understand that, if that, but that's a huge point in dealing with that. If you check folate levels in the blood, what are you really testing? You're testing folic acid. And if you have an MTHFR gene mutation, which half of us have, yeah, right, then you don't want to have a lot of folic acid. You want it to convert into methylfolate. So folic acid actually may increase breast cancer risk, colon cancer risk, suppresses natural killer cells. If you have that MTHFR mutation, you're increasing those risks. So a normal folate level may look fine, but in fact, you may have major issues. And looking at homocysteine is a better way to assess that. We're aggressive. Most doctors don't look at homocysteine levels, but methylation may be the most important detox pathway in the body with that. So it may list normal homocysteine up to 15 or 18, but we target 5 to 6 on our homocysteine level as a way to tell, the most important with methylation is folate. Number 2 is B12. Number 3 is B6. So B6 levels, if you check that in the blood, guess what? If you see a high reading, a lot of times it's an inverse indicator that you don't have the enzyme to convert it into the active form. And so that's why I rely on dreams as far as B6 levels with that. But B12 is a huge issue. And if you can just get this one point across in this interview today, is simply that you cannot trust vitamin B12 blood levels. Now, first of all, in America, the cutoff is 220 on B12, right? But in Japan, it's 550. Who do you think is right on that? I found clinically that Japan and Europe is about 500. They definitely are right. So levels in the 400s, 300s are associated with substantial symptoms on B12. But take my wife, for example. Her B12 level was high. Does that mean she's getting too much B12? Checked it twice. Same thing. It rang high. But I tried a B12 injection with her. What happened? She loves them. Gives her more energy, improves her focus with that. Why would that be the case? Well, there are 4 different gene mutations that impact the transfer of B12 from the blood into cells. If you have a lithium deficiency, you're not transporting it from the blood into cells. So basically, B12 is stuck in the blood. So even, first of all, the normal levels are off, and even when it's normal, and especially maybe when it's high, you're not transporting it. So I have a lot of my patients on injectable B12 from a compounding pharmacy. I use methylcobalamin. By using it in injectable form, insulin syringe and needle, hardly can feel it. We use it in the hip. And it's a slow release, so you don't get overstimulated giving it in that way. So that I worked for 10 years, I don't currently, for a company called SpectraCell in Houston that does micronutrient testing intracellularly, right? So another example with B12, I had a patient whose B12 level was either normal or high, and she had upper extremity weakness. And I did SpectraCell. She was in the bottom 1% on B12. I gave her B12 injections, and her upper arm weakness disappeared just with 1 or 2 injections. All that problem. B12 important for myelination, important for mood, has a wealth of benefits associated with that. So zinc is a very important nutrient. So I deal with LabCorp, and I think they'll forgive me for saying this, but they base the zinc levels on what the population normal range is, right? The thing is, though, the normal zinc levels back 30, 40, 50 years ago are different from today because everyone eats out now and gets food. Anytime you eat out just about or eat food that's not organic, you're getting Roundup in almost everything, and therefore you're not getting the zinc or the magnesium that you need. And incidentally, zinc and magnesium both boost testosterone and lower estrogen. So the impact of Roundup is estrogenic. And also I mentioned black folate acid folate, and that's also estrogenic. And in fact, any chemical you get, for example, preservatives, when you go to the grocery store, if you buy foods with preservatives, where are those metabolized? In the liver, which also metabolizes estrogen. Mm-hmm. So anytime you're giving those preservatives, you're increasing estrogen levels, right? So essentially all chemicals are estrogenic if they're metabolized in the liver, which nearly all of them are. All heavy metals are estrogenic for the same reason associated with that. There's another company that I'm starting to use called Vibrant Wellness that also does, hopefully they're doing, I need to check further to be sure those are intracellular, but I think that those are. But I certainly can vouch for SpectraCell with that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So aside from the nutrient testing, what are your thoughts on like testing for genetic variants, right? And I know Wild Health does this. I learned some interesting stuff about myself. Like I have the ApoE3, E4 variant. And I guess my question for you is that helpful in the long run? Like if someone is otherwise a healthy individual who...
Very helpful.
Yeah.
And I could, if you want, I could take the ApoE example because 25 to 30% of us have an ApoE4. It's not just you. And so there are, as you know, substantial concerns in terms of cardiovascular risk, in terms of neurologic risk associated with that. And there's research showing, number one, that exercise, 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise, 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, neutralize the impact on autopsy. The brain looked identical on autopsy. So exercise is huge with that. But also the HSV virus, for one, herpes simplex virus, which can cause mouth sores, for example. If you have that virus, a 12-fold higher risk for the neurological implications with it, right? So that's huge to address HSV. So how do you address HSV? Well, with arginine promotes viral illness. Lysine is antiviral, okay? So arginine is in what I call the C-SPAN foods: citrus, coffee, cinnamon, chocolate, potatoes, apples, nuts. So yeah, well, and you need some of those. Arginine promotes growth hormone and is a vasodilator, which helps with blood pressure and circulation to the extremities. But if you eat more than 2 categories per day, for example, if I eat an apple a day, I will get mouth sores from eating an apple a day because the arginine in the apple is suppressing my lysine level. So I take lysine to kind of counterbalance that effect. I had a patient, actually an employee that had herpes type 2. She don't work here anymore, but she found that if she took 3 reishi 3 times a day and 3 lysine 3 times a day, that would knock that out within 24 hours for her. But yeah, herpes, if you haven't tested for HSV1, then I would test for that, and then I would be using some strategies. Dr. Del Bredesen talks about 20 different organisms that can impact dementia risk, and there are at least 6 in the herpes family. We all have herpes. We've all had Epstein-Barr virus. That's mononucleosis. I say all 90% of us have had that. 80% of us have had cytomegalovirus, and that's another herpes family of viruses. So by monitoring our arginine lysine scenario, and lysine protects against colds and flu, and arginine promotes colds and flu. So particularly during the winter, you want to keep tabs on that. But I have a whole handout of things with my ApoE folks. I had a colleague with that, and she said acetyl-L-carnitine was particularly good for that. Magnesium threonate were 2 of her favorite supplements with ApoE4. But MTHFR, obviously very, very important to know about if you have that, and particularly if you have the A1298 gene mutation, because with that mutation, you can't convert folic acid into methylfolate in your brain. So you can get depressed, you can get anxious, you can get brain fog, but guess what? It does not affect homocysteine levels. So you may have a perfectly normal or ideal homocysteine level, which normally monitors methylation, but because of A1298, you may be depressed or anxious or brain fog. So everyone needs to get some methylfolate. Now, occasionally methylfolate's overstimulating, but we all need to be getting at least a multivitamin that has some methylfolate on board. Now, you can get folate naturally through leafy greens, but with leafy greens, you want to be a little cautious. Oxalates are a huge issue. Kidney stones, 80 to 90% of kidney stones are calcium oxalate stones, right? They form needle-like crystals. And so if you eat a lot of spinach, for example, spinach has the highest oxalates of any food. So you think with Popeye, I need to eat lots of spinach, right? But I really caution my patients to limit it to like 2 spinach leaves per day on average. Maybe
Is that for everyone though, Dr. Roach? Like, how does one tell if they're oxalate sensitive? Is that just by like joint issues, like physical symptoms? Is there a specific test to tell if you're oxalate sensitive? Like, how does that work?
First of all, it's my belief that half of patients that have aches and pains have those pains due to the oxalates. Major cause of myalgias, that's muscle aching, and also joint aches as well. So as far as testing, my favorite way to test it is
Elimination.
Well, there are several strategies. Organic acid testing is a good strategy. For example, Mosaic does organic acid testing of oxalates. You can do an oxalate creatinine spot ratio. So LabCorp that I have in my office can do one of those. If it's elevated, it's helpful, but if it's normal, it's not. But, one of the strategies in figuring out oxalates for me is how many nights a week do you remember your dreams? Because how are oxalates removed from our body? It's by that transsulfuration pathway, the dream pathway with that. So if you're not dreaming, you have a functional vitamin B6 deficiency. And if you don't have B6, then you can't get those oxalates out of your system. And if you don't have B6, also you don't convert glutamate to GABA. So you're going to be overstimulated. You're going to be more anxious associated with that as well. And then do you eat out or do you eat organic? Because, again, oxalates are associated with Roundup. And so then you're almost always going to have oxalate issues if you're not eating organic foods to some extent. So those are some of the ways that I use to determine that.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the carnivore diet?
Well, I think we each are different. So if you have ancestry from the equator, then you had access to vegetables and fruits 24/7, right? So I think a vegetarian type of approach is optimal for those individuals. For people with Northern European heritage, so if you have blue eyes or light-colored eyes, if you have naturally blonder hair, then you had to survive the winters with some animal products with that. So their genes are more adapted to animal products. So really, I think listening to your body is very key here. So if you feel great on a vegetarian diet, go for that. Now, of course, B12 deficiency is a risk. Other deficiencies like zinc and iodine might be an issue on a vegetarian diet. So you need to be aware of that. But if you feel good, great. If you don't feel good, then incorporate some organic animal products and see how that goes. We normally limit red meat in our recommendations to once a month, ideally, because of the iron concern. However, menstruating females certainly could eat more red meat. But, with the animal products, 95% of all toxins come from animal products. The fat in the animal products is the issue because that's where the toxins are stored. So that's why it's so critical to get organic with any meat sources. And with chicken, they put arsenic in the chicken feed to keep the rats from eating it, right? But not enough to kill the chicken. So if you're getting regular chicken, you're likely getting significant arsenic along with that.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. And I told you with Wild Health, just for my own testing, I learned that my ApoB, I think, was like 109, which is extremely high for a 29-year-old otherwise healthy individual. So I completely, I really reduced meat, and it dropped Dr. Roach by like 30 points in 2 months. Yeah. So I found that a mostly like plant-based Mediterranean diet, not as much red meat, has been, an adequate diet that I feel good on.
Yeah, and that's, with your ApoE4 in there, that's particularly important.
Right.
But what I consider and what research really suggests a normal cholesterol level, and you're right, the ApoB is a more accurate reading compared to LDL cholesterol. But look, total cholesterol, optimal, if you don't have cardiovascular issues, is probably 230. The optimal LDL cholesterol, if you don't have cardiovascular issues, is probably 130. And so keep in mind, the brain is 53% cholesterol. Keep in mind, our hormones are made out of cholesterol. So when you lower cholesterol, what's happening? You're lowering hormones, right? So when you take statin cholesterol medicine, for example, it does help keep the arteries in the brain open. But are you shrinking your brain? Because the brain matter is not going to have access to as much cholesterol that it may need to form new branches with that, right? If hormones are anabolic, building and strengthening to, in my opinion, every organ and tissue, including testosterone with that, then what's the opposite of anabolic? Catabolic. So when you give statins and lower cholesterol, that is catabolic, meaning shrinking, shriveling every organ and tissue in your body. Statins are associated with side effects in every organ and tissue. And obviously, lowering hormones has to be a key mechanism associated with that. It's a mitochondrial toxin. Why? Because what is CoQ10 made through? That same HMG-CoA reductase pathway that lowers cholesterol lowers 100% of the time the CoQ10 levels, because it's made by that mechanism. And without that energy in your mitochondria, then you don't get the nutrients in you need. You don't get rid of the toxins as readily associated with that. So, for example, there's a 10-year VA study that statins were associated with an 87% increase in diabetes. So statin cholesterol medicines are a major concern for a number of reasons. They're catabolic in their effects. And by that, I mean hormones are made from cholesterol. So anytime you lower cholesterol, you're lowering hormone levels. And since hormones are anabolic, lowering them is catabolic. That is, they're shrinking, shriveling every organ and tissue in your body. For example, with my diabetic patients, they get neuropathy from the statin cholesterol medicine. In fact, statins cause more neuropathy than diabetes does in my diabetic patients. There's research in the Journal of Neurology back in 2003. If you're on a statin, it's associated with a 16-fold higher risk of polyneuropathy, neuropathy affecting multiple nerves. If you're on them beyond 2 years, a 26-fold increase in polyneuropathy. So the way I know this is the situation, because when I stop statins in my diabetic patients, their neuropathy gets better just within days associated with that. And
I have a question for you, though, on that, Dr. Roach. So this is in the context of like diabetes, right, and other chronic diseases that can be managed with more natural approaches, right?
Yeah.
But what about when it comes to cancer? And I'm sure you've heard of Jane McClelland and her whole cocktail approach to cancer management and her use of statins to essentially help cure herself of stage 4. My mom was on a statin and some other drugs, a few years ago. Again, I mentioned we tried a lot of different off-label drugs, but what's your take on that, right? In that type of scenario, if a patient is trying to target like those cancer pathways using a statin?
Sure. So hormones promote cancer growth. So when you lower hormones with a statin, that will slow cancer growth just on that basis. They also are somewhat anti-inflammatory, but it will compromise your quality of life when you do so. Right. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of the pros and cons. Now, I would probably prefer to use red yeast extract. It's important to get a quality red yeast extract because that's where statins originally came from, right? Was from red yeast extract. And for example, research in the American Journal of Cardiology, once again around 2003, showed that red yeast extract reduced risk of death 33%. And reduced risk of cardiovascular death 30%, and the secondary endpoint of cancer 56%. So there is research to certainly suggest that red yeast extract can do so, and I'd much rather get the whole plant than get one derivative of the plant, such as the statin cholesterol medicine. So if you're interested in that route, and there is research, for example, with red yeast, if you get radiation, that protects against tumor cells breaking loose and promoting metastasis from radiation. So that would be my preference in that scenario.
Interesting. All right. That makes sense. I cut you off, though. You were saying something else about the statin.
Oh, I could talk
I'm sure you could.
about statins. But yeah, if I didn't mention that the VA study, 87% high risk of diabetes and high risk for obesity, marked obesity with that. And it causes a slew of other nutrient deficiencies. It calcifies the arteries. Is another concern. And cardiologists say, well, that stabilizes plaque. But if you calcify arteries, what's that going to do to blood pressure? If your adrenaline kicks in, a child will just stretch out their arteries. But if your arteries calcify, then your blood pressure shoots up. So a big question I have is, do statins increase your blood pressure? Because my number one natural blood pressure treatment is coenzyme Q10. There's a meta-analysis of 8 studies that found a 16/11 drop in CoQ10 with 100 to 200 milligrams over a 6-week period of time. Another meta-analysis of 6 studies showed a 13/9 drop in blood pressure with CoQ10. And CoQ10 lowers blood sugar, it promotes circulation, improves mitochondrial function. So that's definitely an important nutrient for us.
Yeah, very interesting. My mom had high blood pressure for years, Dr. Roach, and she was on a statin for years. With her cancer recurrence in 2018, she dramatically changed her diet. Not that it was bad, but she became much more strict about it.
Yeah.
And she was actually able to get off of her blood pressure medication, which was incredible. And her doctors were like, how did you drop it? She's like, oh, just my diet. Something as foundational as that, you know?
I was at a neighborhood party yesterday, and a gentleman came up to me and said, well, your father treated me when my blood pressure, when I was just, even in high school or just out of high school, my blood pressure shot up. And he simply said, stop putting salt on your food. And it's now been 50 years later, and he's quite healthy and doing well. So salt, I'm very salt sensitive myself. And, the DASH diet talks about 2,000 milligrams of salt. But for me, if I get more than like 200 milligrams of sodium, so I think that's the single most important thing. Now, maybe not 100% of individuals have hypertension associated with that, but I would say at least 80% are impacted substantially by sodium. So again, you want to avoid processed foods because they always have sodium in them. In butter, salt is maybe the number 2 ingredient in butter. It's the number 2 ingredient in cheese. It's in breads. Of course, you want to keep away from gluten unless you want grain brain or wheat belly, or you like or your testosterone. So it's ubiquitous, and it's important to eliminate.
What are your thoughts on avoiding gluten? Because I have a gluten intolerance, not celiac, right? And I know many people have gluten intolerance.
Yeah.
For someone who doesn't, right, who lives in the United States, would you still recommend they avoid gluten?
Absolutely, yeah. Because the bread in the United States is not like bread in Europe.
Right.
We have bread over the last 40, 50 years, increasing the gluten content in bread maybe 3 to 4-fold. So it's much less healthier than it used to be. And as I mentioned, grain brain is a common issue. I've tested that for myself. I even will stutter a little bit with gluten. And also wheat belly, it causes, goes straight to your belly. And the more fat cells you have, the more you're converting testosterone into estrogen. So again, when I'm speaking to my male patients, whenever you want estrogen, go for the gluten. But whatever. And really, I'm cautious about all grains. Now, rice, organic corn, if you need, if you're real thin, you need to get some carbohydrates. And so maybe send 2 or 3 days a week. But for most of the rest of us, I'm not a big grain fan. I'd largely avoid it.
Interesting. What does your diet look like? What is a typical Dr. Roach diet day?
All right. Well,
are you a creature of habit? Do you do the same meals every day?
Largely similar meals. But now, it was a number of years ago, my PSA level, prostate screening test, went to 12.5. And 4 is the upper limit on PSA. So that greatly concerned me at the time. In fact, I panicked. And that taught me of an important lesson, because it's so key with cancer issues to stay in a peaceful state. If you implant breast tumors in mice and you stress one group of the mice that is stressed has a 30 increase in metastases if you give the drug propranolol that prevents most of those, right? So peacefulness is huge with that. let me get back on track. What the point I was making? Yeah.
What about modified citrus pectin?
Yeah. Modified citrus pectin is helpful for lowering lectin levels, which promotes metastases in tumors. So you can actually test galectin-3 in the blood to determine that. And I use a cutoff of about 17 on galectin-3 with that. But yeah, modified citrus pectin, the most effective way. I tend to do it the last thing at night so it doesn't interfere with other supplementation preference.
Yeah, interesting. There are just so many thoughts right now, Dr. Roach. I told you we're going to go down so many different rabbit holes. One other thing that you mentioned in your talk, this NM23 factor, right, which suppresses metastasis. You know, if you remove the primary tumor, right, that factor, like, it doesn't necessarily like express itself. So I guess my question for you is, and I'm just looking at my mom's case, right? She had stage 2 in 2008. She had a mastectomy, opted to not do chemo. But if someone does have a tumor, they have a biopsy, it's stage 2 cancer, what do they do in that case? Do they just not touch it? And I know obviously like you want to try to remove everything around it. So a mastectomy is probably preferable to a lumpectomy. But with this NM23 factor, like what does one do in that case?
Well, I don't think it's cookie cutter. I think you really have to look at each individual situation. And I want to back up from that a little bit. You've heard me talk about mammograms if you listen to that other lecture. And so first of all, I would encourage women to utilize other sources of imaging other than mammograms. And that imagine a tumor, when it's 2 millimeters in size, the size of your pupil, it gets a blood supply. And so if you get a mammogram and you squish that, what happens to those tumor cells? Do they get in the bloodstream? Do they hang out in the bone marrow? Now, they may not form a metastases because they have to get a blood supply. When would they get a blood supply? Well, then when you get breast surgery, that creates a wound, and that wound sends out a message to grow new blood vessels. And then those cells hanging out in the bone marrow, the liver can get that same message to grow new blood vessels. So then they can form. So normally it would take 7 years for a tumor to form, right? So the fact that so many metastases appear just 12 to 18 months after surgery, in my opinion, those are ones that are promoted through handling of the tumor and mammograms. So I would... First of all, I don't like the idea of sticking a needle in to diagnose a breast tumor. That's what insurance companies require. But it makes more sense to me to excise the whole tumor area and then determine what type of tumor and how aggressive it is at that point. But if you stick a needle in it, it's a little bit to me like sticking a needle in a hornet's nest, right? You're stirring up issues to some of the tumor cells getting in the bloodstream. And actually, there's research that suggested that biopsies increase metastasis risk associated with that. Now, if you're going to get a biopsy, though, maybe one strategy to consider is to try to minimizing estrogen at that particular moment. So, where you are in the menstrual cycle might matter, right? You don't want to probably get a biopsy on day 14 of the menstrual cycle when you're ovulating. So it would be better, around the time of menstruation or the first few days after menstruation for getting the biopsy. But maybe that's a scenario where you would want to use a prescription estrogen blocking drug. I had a woman who had a goose egg. This was a 65-year-old woman. It was a 9-centimeter tumor in her breast. And before I had it treated, you could do this even before biopsy, in my opinion. Putting her on an estrogen blocker shrunk that down to 4 centimeters diameter, which is essentially 1/10 of its original volume. Now, 90% of postmenopausal women, their breast tumors, are estrogen dominant. So it worked for her. And then when she had cryoablation as the treatment for that, then that was effective and solved the issue. So actually, cryoablation is a strategy that I would suggest, if the tumor, the research originally was done with, I think, tumors smaller than 2.5 centimeters. And that was shown at least to be as effective as doing conventional treatment with that. There are not many practitioners around the country that do cryoablation, but there are a few. The one near to me is Dr. Kozlowski down to the Comprehensive Breast Center in Knoxville. But there are others out there as well. And so I think that's the strategy to go. So a diagnosis, I would do that. Now, if you have lymph node involvement elsewhere in the body, should you consider chemo? Should you consider other estrogen blockers and so forth? Now, certainly the research with estrogen blockade drugs, and I really speak particularly of aromatase inhibitors in that regard, on postmenopausal women, the research is very positive. But do you have to take those drugs on a daily basis would be one question to ask. They have a long half-life. So I think for a lot of my patients, osteoporosis is a major side effect. Most patients get substantial side effects. So I often reduce it just to every other day, or in some cases even 2 to 3 times a week. Research showing that 5 years out, if you take a 3-month vacation every year from an estrogen blocking drug, the outcomes at 5 years are identical. And it's
Interesting.
Identical. And
wow.
Get pregnant and stop your estrogen blocking drug while you're pregnant, while you get pregnant, and then while you're pregnant, and then maybe 6 months after, that doesn't affect outcomes. In fact, I think if you give those drugs continuously, that's putting pressure on any surviving tumor cells to mutate away. And intermittently, there's less pressure to mutate away from the estrogen receptor status.
Yeah. My mom was on tamoxifen for 9 years before we discovered the recurrence.
Yeah.
And they typically say, I think at first it was 5 years and they keep pushing it out. And again, it's like, what do you do?
Yeah, that's a tough decision. 80% of women who read the side effects of tamoxifen choose not to take it.
Yeah.
Your genetics matter in terms of tamoxifen. I think of it as a prodrug, and you have to metabolize it into the active drug. So with a certain gene mutation, it's not going to be particularly effective anyway. But it blocks the estrogen alpha receptors, but it can promote the estrogen beta receptors. So it may even promote bone metastases and certainly uterine cancers. And clotting.
Well, that's where her recurrence was first. She had 2 spinal mets before it went to her liver. So very interesting. But one thing you mentioned before, Dr. Roach, the word peace, right?
It's huge.
It's huge. It's huge. And again, when I started WellnStrong, I was very passionate about complementary therapies, and I still am. I still believe in an integrative approach, but over the past year or so, with everything my mom has tried and whatnot, I realized that it's not necessarily about the treatment as much as it is about trusting God with the outcome. So I am Christian, and I have realized, Dr. Roach, that again, there's just so much information overwhelm, and I've just found myself in states where I feel, decision paralysis because I don't know what to do next. And through that paralysis, you're forced to look up because you can't, it's not all on your shoulders. And I realized that whatever my mom does opt to do, right? God really is in control of the outcome.
Right.
And that has given me a lot of peace in navigating decisions and recognizing that, the Bible says all our days are written before one yet came to be.
Right.
And I just hold on to those promises. But on the topic of peace, you shared that positive thoughts around the clock can help heal any disorder.
Right.
And I'd love for you to just elaborate on the importance of a positive and peaceful mental state if someone's dealing with cancer or any other chronic illness, or, a caretaker, because it's so, so important.
Yeah. And I'll get into that here in a second. But the first thing I want to mention is I've had 108 patients with spiritual near-death experiences in my office, right? And they report the other realm is more real than this realm. They get mad about coming back. It's kind of peaceful or blissful when they're in that other state. And when they do come back, they're more intuitive and more mission-oriented and focused with that. So with my cancer patients, wanting to get them in a peaceful state, what do I tell them? I point out the downside for you with your cancer is ultimate bliss. That's what my near-death patients report. You're going to do fine. I'm working for your family. They want to keep you around. But this past weekend, I had Vinnie Tolman here, but when he was flying into Lexington, Kentucky, it was raining and it was very bumpy, and a couple of the women on the plane scrimped, but he was almost giddy. And the reason he was almost giddy is he aches for that other side. It was so wonderful over there. He literally, gets depressed and lonely at times because he's not over there. It may have instead to do with you demonstrating your courage, with you demonstrating your faith, and with you teaching others that there are other ways to manage cancer other than conventional approaches. So that may be the purpose of you having, everything has a purpose, okay?
Yeah. Romans 8:28, Dr. Roach. I mean, God works all things together for good. And I started WellnStrong because of my mom,
Yeah.
So he brings good out of things.
So certainly there are bad things that happen, but I don't consider anything evil or negative because it's just individuals that aren't far enough on the learning curve. And on Earth, we're supposed to have service to self individuals versus service to other individuals. That dynamic occurs because it creates knowledge. It creates information contributed to infinite knowledge. If everyone knew everything, if everyone was goody two-shoes, we wouldn't be able to create information. How could we do favors for other people? Because they had everything they need. So it's on purpose the way it is on this. And the key thing is it's teaching us unconditional love, how to love 24/7 unconditionally. It's teaching us to be grateful 24/7. So getting back to your original question, I teach all of my patients quantum physics. I think Einstein was right. E equals mc squared. That was 120 years ago, right, where energy and mass interchange. But a lot of scientists and a lot of individuals don't really understand that. That ends sunk in. A very important study was done 60 years ago called the double slit experiment, where if you take a barrier and put two vertical slits, you take a photon that will go through one of those slits and make a mark. But that's if someone's observing. If no one's observing, what happens? The whole wall lights up. If you take a video recorder, videotape it, what happens? You see a single mark. If you take the battery out of the video recorder, what happens? The whole wall lights up. What does that mean? Waves are going through instead of a photon when you're not observing. Okay. And those waves have an awareness. They have a consciousness because they know when you're observing, when you're not observing. They know when there's a battery in the video recorder and when there's not a battery in the video recorder. Right? That's profound. And scientists didn't know what to do with that at first 60 years ago with that. And you're aware of the work with Masaru Emoto, right? That with water to
water, yeah.
When you give loving messages to one container of water and hateful messages to the other, you freeze it and slice it, look under the microscope, beautiful crystals where you sent love, chaotic structure where you sent hate. And then he just wrote loving messages and taped it on one, wrote hateful messages, taped it on the other, got the identical result. And that research was peer-reviewed and published and duplicated again and again. So water knows when it's being loved and when it's being hated. We're 70% water. And imagine an atom 1 inch in diameter surface of the nucleus, the diameter of the atom 1 mile. So we're 99.9999999% hot air with that. So we're extremely porous when we're in solid particle form, and then we're going back and forth 20,000 times every nanosecond between being a particle and being waves. So every thought we're generating waves, right? If we're having positive thoughts, that's immediately healing to our body. And when we're having negative thoughts, that's immediately detrimental to our body. And then it impacts everyone in our environment and radiates out in the universe ad infinitum. Yeah. Every thought impacts the whole universe. Now, Einstein thought that the speed of light was the fastest that anything could travel. But he described spooky behavior at a distance, where if you have a particle and it splits in half. One half goes to one end of the universe, the other half to the other end of the universe. Any action on one half particle on one side instantly affects the other side. So we are all intimately connected. And a great example of that is mother's intuition. The gentleman won the Nobel Prize, with quantum entanglement. If a child's getting into trouble, mom knows instantly, right here in the chest, whether the child's on the next block or the other side of the street. So we all are instantly connected. So positive thoughts 24/7. I think you can heal most any scenario if you can have positive thoughts 24/7. So how do you do that? Well, number one, set your prayers, say your prayers, set your intentions first thing in the morning, and then when you go to bed at night as well, right? Elite athletes, if they want to win a race, they do what? They visualize. That, right? And because they visualize it, that improves their odds of winning the race. The way Nikola Tesla made it clear was he wrote down each intention 3 times first thing in the morning, 6 times middle of the day, and 9 times at night. And that's how he manifested with that. I have my patients make an angry list. Everyone they've been angry with their whole life. Send love out to those individuals daily. Forgive 3 people every day and maybe ask for forgiveness from some. 10 things you're grateful for in the morning, 10 different things you're grateful for in the evening. If you have a negative thought, you have 17 seconds to cancel that before it snowballs into a second and a third negative thought. So you can say cancel, and then move out of your brain and move into your heart space. The brain's supposed to solve problems like changing a tire in a car, but it's not supposed to get tangled up in emotions. That's the heart's venue. The heart's about peace and love. So if you take some, chest abdominal breaths, just a few of those, and just consciously move out of your brain into your heart space, those emotions fade away. And then you can move into a state of gratitude of, we have indoor plumbing, indoor lighting, we have climate control. We didn't have any of that 100 years ago. We're almost have to invent ways to be unhappy. But everything in life has a purpose. And that is key to understand. So part of the lessons is we're not our physical body. So things happen to our physical body. But guess what? We are our soul inside that physical body, right? We're the spirit inside there. And that's what these lessons of, so if we have physical issues or have had abuse issues or whatever, what are the lessons that we learn? We learn to be stronger. We learn to trust in God in that process, right? So if everything went beautifully, who would care about God, right? But it's important to know, how we were created and what our purpose is here on earth. And the tougher the challenges, the tougher the soul. And it's my belief that before we came on this earth, that we said, I want to have this lesson, I want to have that lesson. And so I think we even designed these for our own growth with that.
A few things that came to mind, Dr. Roach, when you were talking. I think the more science comes out about, again, the power of the mind and the power of gratitude and being at peace, the more it just affirms what's been written in scripture, thousands of years ago. One verse that comes to mind is the one in Proverbs: a heart at peace gives life to the body. The Bible also says life and death is in the power of the tongue. And just to your point about speaking and the power of our thoughts, like one thing I always have my mom, or I really emphasize that she do every day, is just speak life over her body, speak health over her body, in the name of Jesus, because that's the most powerful name.
Those cells have a consciousness and they're listening. And the trees are listening and the grass is listening too. Everything has a consciousness, we've learned. And that is profound. So it's just like a children's book. When you get up in the morning, you can say, well, thank you, pillow, for allowing my head to rest peacefully. Thank you, mattress. Thank you, house, for keeping the rain out, and so forth. Just becoming like children, right? That's biblical as well with that. And love and intimacy are so key. So I'm reading Dean Ornish's book, Love and Survival, at the moment, written 25 years ago. But just simply love and intimacy improve survival 2 to 4-fold. That with any health condition, not just cancer, any health condition. And so the Bible also mentions, you can move mountains, but if you have not love, what have you accomplished? In other words, you can do great things, but it's meaningless unless it's you're sending love along with that. So if you have cancer, you don't need to come up with big programs. You don't need to tell God, well, I'm going to do this great thing or that great thing. Just smile at everyone you encounter. Just say a kind word to everyone that you encounter. That's not only as powerful, it's more powerful than doing great physical things. Okay, that's really what we're here to learn.
The Power of Positive Thinking, Dr. Roach, by Norman Vincent Peale, is my all-time favorite book. And I read that pretty much like 2 or 3 times a year. But everything you're saying, too, is a lot of what he preaches about.
No reason to fear. No reason to fear. And everything has a purpose. Everything ultimately is going to go for the good. You're growing your soul, and you want to grow it as much as possible. So you don't want to stay home isolated. We need to be out there interacting with as many people as we can, sharing this message. And the more we interact, the more we learn, the more the Creator learns from us in this process. And the more our soul grows with that, and the happier we be. If we're in a silo, we become depressed, and it's promoting disease process. So get out there and interact and share, and don't judge, though, in the process, right? So learn that what we need to learn on earth is that not to kill each other, right? Once we learn that lesson, then we can look at joining the universal family. Then we can learn, as far as galaxies, everyone in that galaxy you need to learn not to kill all those individuals as well, because maybe there are lots of ETs out there that we need to learn to get along. But we got to solve the issues here first before we can address those.
Well, Dr. Roach, this has been a wonderful conversation. Again, we've covered so many different topics. You're going to come back on again soon because there's much more to discuss.
I'd love to.
But I really enjoyed meeting with you. You have such a wonderful purpose. Thank you for all the incredible work you're doing. You've also written some incredible books, including Brilliance, I think is your most recent. So where can listeners find you, pick up a copy of some of your books?
Right. So I've written 3 books. They're all available on Amazon, or if you want my autograph on it, you can order it through my office. My office address is themidwaycenter.com. But I also have drroach.net, drroach.net, because I put on a conference every year, the third weekend of October, where I teach everything I know over a 3-day period of time. And so I'm trying to educate practitioners about getting away from prescription drugs and using safer, healthier, natural approaches. It's so much more effective when doing so. And the side effects are positive side effects, less dementia, less cardiovascular risk, and so forth. With that, I have a newsletter that I put out monthly. And so when you contact one of those websites, you can sign up for my newsletter as well. So, Brilliance is my most recent book, Pursuit of Hope, Wisdom, and Divine. My first book, God's House Calls, has over 200 stories that my patients have shared on spiritual near-death experiences, premonitions, intuitions, and so forth. And then my middle book was Vital Strategies in Cancer. So, thanks for doing what you do. You're a beautiful soul. I could tell you so many things about yourself that you don't realize how I could after 47 years of practice, but you're giving so much love to the world. So thank you. Thank you,
Dr. Roach. I really appreciate that. I do have one last question for you, and this is always my favorite one to ask, and that is, what does being well and strong mean to you?
Being well and strong is, number one, getting spiritually grounded, understanding what your purpose is here on this earth. That's the single most important thing. But also it's realizing, let's make our bodies like a temple, because we feel better when we're like a temple, right? So good nutrition, physical activity, balancing our lives, getting a good, healthy night's sleep, and working hard on relationships to make those relationships work, but finding and staying with positive energy people is real important.
I love that. Beautiful. This has been so much fun. Again, I'm looking forward to having you on again soon. And I can't wait to share this with listeners.
You take care.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to support the show, please subscribe, leave a rating and review, and share it with others. Be sure to visit WellnStrong.com to access notes from the show and to stay current with new content. I'm so grateful you joined me. Be well and be strong.